mostly. We are just seriously thrilled to have you here, Professor Pedersen, Sarah. So we'll just leave it to you. You're going to present on a kind of an overview of Scottish suffrage and share some images. And Ian and I are going to just mute ourselves. And then at the very end, so it's probably 45, 50 minutes, if that's correct. And then at the end, may I just really encourage folks, if you have questions, we'll have a brief Q&A at the end, and just pop your questions in the comments and I'll read those out. Okay, so Sarah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tara. And thank you, Tara and Ian, for inviting me to come along this afternoon. This is an amazing project. I think it's really, really exciting. And I'd really encourage everybody to get involved with the project, especially with the fundraising for it. Because what we're here today to talk about is the history of the Scottish Suffragette movement, the suffrage movement, and also, you know, to make it clear that this is very different to what's going on in England. And I think it's really important for Scottish schools to be able to have materials which enables the children to actually position themselves within what was happening in Scotland. So I have some PowerPoint slides, which I am hoping I will be able to share with you. Tell me you see that.
We can absolutely see that.
Okay.
It's perfect.
Thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the history of the Scottish Suffragette movement and the suffragists as well. So I'm going to take you back to start with to the 19th century. And during the 19th century, what we get is a number of reform bills going through the House of Commons, the Houses of Parliament, expanding the suffrage, expanding who is allowed to vote for MPs. And by the 1860s, this is you know, a good amount of people who are now allowed to vote. It's even started to include some working class people, particularly if they live in towns. Well, of course, you know, I say people, I don't mean people, do I? I mean men. No women has the vote for the House of Commons. And by the 1860s, especially sort of middle and upper class women are beginning to start getting together to campaign for the vote. So by the beginning of the 20th century, we have groups of women throughout the country, and they're now under this umbrella body called the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And as you can see, according to this poster here, they have over 449 societies all over the country, including in Scotland. Now, these women tend to meet in drawing rooms, or they might have little meetings in town halls or wherever they can hire. Historians call them constitutional suffragists because they believe in campaigning for the vote using constitutional means. So that means writing letters, perhaps to the MP, perhaps to the Prime Minister, and signing petitions. And every year you get petitions being handed in to number 10 with thousands of women's signatures on them. And they get absolutely nowhere. So in 1903, one of the women who's been involved in this constitutional suffrage movement, a woman called Emmeline Pankhurst, and we can see her here, she's got this amazing hat on. She, you know, just loses patience, and she decides to set up a different kind of organization to campaign for the vote for women. And that's called the Women's Social and Political Union. Now, Emmeline Pankhurst comes from socialist circles in Manchester. Her husband had been a socialist politician. And so many of the first women who join her organization are from that kind of milieu. And she's also joined by her three daughters, Christabel, Adele, and the other one whose name is Sylvia. Thank you. Okay, so they have a new approach. It's not writing letters and it's not signing petitions anymore. Instead, what they're going to do is they're actually going to go directly to the politicians and ask them to support women's suffrage. And so what they do is they go along to political meetings. And at the end, there's a moment for questions from the floor, and they stand up and they try to ask the MP, do you agree with votes for women? Now, this all sounds absolutely fine to us, this sort of thing that happens every day. But to Edwardian sensibilities, the idea that women could go to political meetings, and even worse, try and speak at them, well, it was just absolutely shocking. And so what we get is an attempt to remove these women from the building. They shouldn't be allowed to speak at all, get them out. And they start having scuffles as they're dragging these women out of these meetings. Now, in 1905, Christabel Pankhurst, Emmeline's daughter, that's the lady here, and on the left, her friend, Annie Kenny, who's a mill girl, they go to a meeting in Manchester, being held by Lord Edward Grey, and again, they try and ask a question about votes for women, and they're immediately dragged outside into the street. Now, Christabel is actually studying for a law degree, so she knows exactly what she needs to do in order to get arrested, and she spits in the face of the policeman. So they are dragged off to the magistrate's court, and the magistrate said, well, I'm sorry, ladies, but I'm going to have to find you guilty of breach of the peace, and I'm going to have to fine you. And Christabel said, we won't pay the fine. And he said, no, 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 you don't understand. If you don't pay that fine, you are going to have to go to prison. And Christabel said, yes. And so they are both sent to prison. Well, the story was on every single morning newspaper the next day. And Mrs. Pankhurst saw how much coverage they were getting. And she said, right, that's it. That's what we're doing from now on. Our new policy is you go to meetings, you try and ask the question, and if you are arrested, you refuse to pay the fine, you go to prison and we'll have more publicity. Now, I don't want you to run away with the idea that just because Annie Kenny was a mill girl, that either the suffragists or the suffragettes were campaigning for all women to get the vote, because they weren't. About 60% of men at this point had the vote, mostly upper and middle class men. And so what women were campaigning for was the right for women to vote on the same terms as men. So someone like Annie Kenny, who's this working class mill girl, she to me is the real heroine here, because she's going to prison for the right for other women to get the vote. And the idea was that these middle class women would get the vote, and then they would work with their political power in order to ameliorate the situation of their poorer working class sisters. Now, at the end of 1905, there's a general election, and the Liberals have a landslide win. It's very, very exciting. And this gentleman becomes Prime Minister. He's actually the MP for Stirling. It's Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman. And both the suffragists and the suffragettes are very excited when he becomes Prime Minister, when the Liberals get into power, because they think that the Liberals surely will give women the vote. I mean, one of the big tenets that Liberals hold to is no taxation without representation. And so many middle and upper class women are paying some form of tax, so surely they should get the vote. Now, this Liberal government is a very, very reforming government. They are the government that brings in old age pensions for the first time. They also attempt to reform the House of Lords. However, they're not so keen on rushing forward with the idea of the vote for women. A lot of those MPs, when they had been going around the country asking people to vote for them, yes, they had said yes, they thought women should have the vote, eventually. And it turns out that eventually doesn't mean in the next term of Parliament. So women everywhere are really frustrated by this. And Mrs. Pankhurst comes up with a new tactic. She says the Liberals have this enormous majority, and what we're going to do now is to campaign to minimise that majority. We're going to go to every by-election, and we're going to ask people to vote against the Liberals. We're not going to say vote for the Tories or vote for the Labour Party. What we're going to say is don't vote for the Liberals. And we're going to remove this majority until the Liberal government give in and give women the vote. So she has to have a national organisation to make this work. So she moves the headquarters from Manchester down to London, and she starts sending women out all over the country to establish branches of the WSPU. Now, the woman who is tasked to go to Scotland is this lady here. Her name is Teresa Billington. She's from Manchester. She's a school teacher. She comes from these socialist circles. She had started out as a school teacher, but then she'd been hired by the Independent Labour Party to be the first woman paid organiser. And she was so good that when Mrs. Pankhurst saw how good she was, she asked her to come and work for the WSPU. So she arrives in Edinburgh in 1906, and crowds rush out to listen to her. She normally speaks out of doors, and there are hundreds of people there. Now, most of the people turn up because Teresa Billington is one of these notorious women who've been to prison. She's fought with policemen. Well, of course you turn up to see her. I mean, she's a celebrity. She's notorious. But they stayed because actually she was a brilliant speaker. She was witty. She dealt incredibly well with hecklers. And if you weren't able to go and see her, the newspapers would give her entire speeches verbatim the next day, so you could read exactly what she said. And she starts to travel around Scotland, encouraging women to join the WSPU, encouraging women, in fact, to leave all the suffragist organisations and to come over to the militant side. One of the first women in Scotland who does this is Helen Fraser, who's a Glaswegian artist. And the two of them travel around the country. And Helen, in fact, later on becomes the leader of the Scottish branches of the WSPU. So, this is a photograph we have of Helen speaking. Now, this is in Laurencekirk. This is in the south of Aberdeen, and Aberdeenshire was having a by-election in 1907. So along come the WSPU, people like Helen, and they go and they try and persuade men to vote against the Liberals. So unlike the constitutional suffragists who are having their meetings in their drawing rooms and talking to other women, the suffragettes are going out there and they're trying to persuade men. And they can't afford to hire rooms or anything. So here she is, she's turned up at the Farmer's Mart in Laurencekirk, and she has basically just got a stool that she's standing on. She doesn't have any form of microphone or megaphone or anything like that. And she's shouting to make herself be heard. And you can look at these lovely faces of these gentlemen, and you can see that that looks like a hard audience, really. It's February as well, so it's very, very cold. She's wearing her best clothes. Mrs. Pankhurst was very keen on her ladies looking their best when they were representing the WSPU. But despite that, often what these women found was great hostility. There would be a lot of heckling. There would be people shouting all sorts of abuse. Sometimes people would throw mud or they'd throw stones. Occasionally they'd try and tear the woman off her stool or whatever she was standing on. Sometimes they would rip her clothing because of that. And once or twice they would pick them up bodily and dump them in a stream or a duck pond or whatever that was near. And they would go home that evening and they would dust themselves off and they would stitch up their clothes and they would go out, and the next morning they would go and do it again and try and persuade men not to vote for the Liberals. Now, one of the reasons that Mrs. Pankhurst was so keen on her ladies looking their best was because most people hadn't seen a suffragette, and the only images they had was the ones that they got from the funny postcards or cartoons that you could find in local newspapers that looked something like this. And I have to say, it's a real pity that this image does look quite a bit like Helen Fraser. But the idea of these cartoons was saying that the suffragettes were ugly old harridans who had nothing better to do with their time than to go around fighting policemen and meddling in men's politics. And the idea is that they weren't married, they didn't have children to look after. And also it was suggested that they attacked policemen in the hope that policemen would arrest them, because that embrace of a Bobby's arms might be, it was suggested, the only time they had the touch from a man. So we have all these really awful pictures and images of women floating around. Mrs. Pankhurst, who's a fantastic PR woman, she insists, for example, that the most attractive girls in the WSPU sit at the front of the meetings so that people could see that this wasn't at all what the real suffragettes look like. Now, whilst we have Helen Fraser and Teresa Billington travelling around the country and building up support for the militant tactics of the WSPU, in these early years, in fact, most of the militancy is happening down in London. So if you were a Scottish suffragette, you actually had to get on a train and you had to go down to London in order to get involved with some militant activity. So what could you expect to do? Well, one of the things that the militant suffragettes did is that they would go en masse, they would all meet up, you'd get off your train and you'd go en masse, maybe 200 of you, to Oxford Street or Bond Street, where the new department stores with their fantastic plate glass windows were. And at a signal, maybe somebody would blow a whistle, you would all smash the windows and then you would run as fast as you could to get back on that train. And of course, if you didn't run fast enough, then you would be arrested. The image, by the way, is not a real suffragette. It's from a film, a black and white silent film that was called The Suffragette. Another thing you might do is you would go down to meetings and you might hear some of the leaders of the organisation talk, like Christabel Pankhurst or Emmeline Pankhurst, and they'd get you all fired up. And then you would march arm in arm towards Westminster. And the idea was that women would try in waves and waves after women to get one woman through the phalanx of policemen that were guarding the House of Commons, to try and get one woman right into the House of Commons where women weren't allowed to go. And of course the police would be fighting back, and you can see this image of the police with the batons would be hitting the women, and they'd be thrown on the floor and their clothes would be ripped, etc., etc. But this tended to happen in London, so if you're a Scottish suffragette, that's where you went. Of course, there were also things that happened in Scotland, and in 1907, in autumn of 1907, one of the biggest marches so far, a procession along Princes Street in Edinburgh happened and involved women from all over the country. Women were invited to come down from the northeast, come across from Glasgow, come up from the borders, and eventually we have 1,000 women marching in procession along Princes Street. And this isn't just the suffragettes. This was organised by the WSPU, but they put out a hand of friendship and they asked suffragist organisations to come as well. In Aberdeen, for example, they actually hired a train to bring women down for the day. Now, this was obviously quite a political move. Suffragists were quite sore at the number of women they were basically hemorrhaging into the more militant organisations. So it took a lot to persuade suffragists to come along and march with their suffragette sisters. But what a display they made. And what's really important about this is we talk about feminism as being a collective action. And we talk about the suffrage movement as the first wave of feminism, the first wave of collective action, where women are marching together as a group to demand votes for women. And they were told to wear the same colours, and they wore rosettes and they had sashes, and they carried banners and bannerets in these colours to make them look more like a collective rather than a bunch of individuals. And notice the men there, the men who are used to be the people processing down at places like Princes Street, while the women are supposed to be standing in the crowds waving their handkerchiefs. Now it's the men having to look on as the women, take over the streets. They are the ones marching, and the men are being held back by the police. So this is a real change in what's going on in gendered relationships at that time. Now, so you've got the suffragists and the suffragettes all marching together. Because it's so political, they decided that they would run it by alphabetical order. And so whenever I'm talking to people from Aberdeen, I always make the point that the Aberdeen contingent is therefore the one right at the front behind the band. What's so amazing about this particular procession isn't just that they managed to get the suffragists and the suffragettes together, but by autumn 1907, the suffragettes themselves had split up. So remember I told you about Teresa Billington and how she came from the socialist circles of Manchester. So a lot of the women who had joined the WSPU when Emmeline Pankhurst had set it up had started to become concerned about what can only be described as the dictatorial tendencies of Emmeline Pankhurst. She now saw herself as the general of the suffragette army, and basically you could not criticize her or question her. If she said go and do that, you were just supposed to do it. If she said be over there, you were supposed to go. She didn't want debate, she didn't want discussion. She thought that that was a waste of time, that she had to make the decisions and everybody had to stick with them. Now, there was supposed to be a big WSPU conference coming up in the autumn of 1907, and Teresa Billington and other women start writing to each other saying, well, Mrs. Pankhurst, don't get me wrong, lovely woman, we wouldn't be where we are today without her, but possibly it's time for her to step down. Possibly it's time for other people to step up, and maybe individual branches should have more say in the way in which they run things. And maybe we should have meetings to discuss the Constitution a lot, and maybe we should have some changes to make it more democratic. Well, Mrs. Pankhurst got to hear about these rumblings of dissent. And she said, okay, this conference that you want to do these things at, cancelled. And the Constitution you're so keen on. Yeah, we're getting rid of that. And if you don't like the way I'm running the WSPU, you can leave. And 60 to 70 women, most of whom had been with her from the start, they did leave. And they start up another militant organisation, and it's called the Women's Freedom League. And the reason it's so important in Scotland is that Teresa Billington, the person who'd come to Scotland, who'd helped to set up the branches of the WSPU in Scotland, she sets up now the Women's Freedom League. And so a lot of the people who had followed her naturally followed her into the Women's Freedom League. So when we talk about the Scottish Suffragettes, yes, some of them are still answering to Mrs. Pankhurst, but there's a whole other group of them who are members of the Women's Freedom League. And we really need to remember that. And it's one of the key differences that we see in Scotland. So for example, this lady here, she's a member of the Women's Freedom League. Her name is Anna Munro. She's from Dunfermline. And in 1908, she goes down, she's one of these suffragettes who goes down to London to do some militant action. And she has an idea, she has lots of Votes for Women pamphlets, and she thinks it would be a brilliant idea if at the opening of the Houses of Parliament, as the King is going in his carriage, she will leap up onto the carriage and thrust the pamphlets into his lap through the open window. And she attempts to do this only to discover that the King has actually shut the window, so she can't do it. So instead she goes to the house of a cabinet minister, and she tries to have a meeting, a suffrage meeting on the steps of his house, and she's arrested and she's sent to prison in 1908 down in London. So that's the kind of activity that some of the Scottish suffragettes were doing down in London. But we also start to have more militant activity up here in Scotland. And again, this is a Women's Freedom League person I'm talking about here. Again, in 1908, there's a by-election in Dundee, and Winston Churchill stands to be elected. He's a Liberal at the time, and what's interesting is he's already stood in one by-election that year in Manchester, and he failed to get in. And of course, Manchester being the birthplace of the WSPU claimed it was because of their campaigning that he'd failed to win the Manchester seat. So he comes up to Dundee, and all of the leaders of the WSPU come after him. The Pankhursts are there, Emmeline and Christabel are there, but also a lot of Women's Freedom League people are there. And it has to be said that the Dundonians perhaps weren't so clear about the distinctions between these two militant groups, and they tended to tar them with the same brush. So on a particularly lovely day, it was decided that Mr. Churchill would address the workers at a foundry during their lunchtime. And they were all asked to come outside the foundry, and here you can see they've come out to listen to him speak. However, when he got up and opened his mouth, a member of the Women's Freedom League called Mary Maloney, and here she is there, every time he opened his mouth to speak, she rang a large dinner bell, and nobody could hear a word he said. In fact, he tried to move the meeting around the corner, and she followed and kept ringing the dinner bell. Well, absolute outrage broke out in the Dundee newspapers as the brightest and best of Dundee thought that this was so humiliating, such an embarrassment for the city to have this suffragette doing this incredibly annoying and really rude behaviour to Mr. Winston Churchill. In fact, the abuse was so much that Emmeline and Christabel actually wrote a letter to the Dundee newspapers trying to say, look, it wasn't us, it's the Women's Freedom League, completely different group, but no one really was listening. I've talked about the suffragists, and I've talked about now these two groups of suffragettes. There's another group that we need to be aware of that are also holding meetings in Scotland, and this is the Anti-Suffrage Campaigners. There are a lot of women who don't want the vote, and actually they get together in an organisation and go around the country, somewhat bizarrely, having political meetings to say that they don't want to be involved in politics. Here we have no votes, thank you. They felt that women being involved in politics would unfeminized women. There was a whole variety of arguments based on things like it's not what God would want, that women were represented by their husbands anyway, and that there was, it would desex women, it would get rid of their femininity if they had to be involved in the dirty world of politics. My absolute favorite argument is it wouldn't be fair on unmarried men if women got the vote, because if women got the vote, they would of course marry as their husband, they would vote as their husband told them to vote. And so unmarried men would only have one vote and married men would have two. Now, the leader in Scotland of this group of women is Lady Tully-Barden, and she goes around the country speaking on platforms, talking about why women shouldn't get the vote. Okay, another very famous Scottish suffragette is Marion Wallace Dunlop from Inverness, and it is she who is the first person to go on hunger strike when she's sent to prison. This is in 1909. She's another Scottish suffragette who's gone down to London, and she's arrested for daubing slogans on St. Stephen's Hall. She goes to prison and she immediately goes on hunger strike. Now, she doesn't go on hunger strike because she thinks that she shouldn't be in prison. She said, no, I did the crime, I will do the time. She goes on hunger strike because she's in the second-class prison. Now, Edwardian prisons were two classes. If you were a political prisoner, you got to go to a first-class prison. And there you could wear your own clothes, you could have food and drink sent in for you, you could have visitors at any time, you could have letters. It sounds quite nice, actually. However, then you have the second-class prisons, and they are the ones where you have to wear a prison uniform, you have to do work such as sewing sacks, and you're given the basic prison gruel and bread and tea that most prisoners are served. Now, what Marion Wallace Dunlop said was, I'm a political prisoner. I'm here because I want votes for women. Therefore, I should be in the first-class prison. And I will go on hunger strike until you move me into the first-class prison. And of course, the newspapers loved this. The minute they heard that there was a woman who was trying to starve herself into a different prison, it was covered every single day. There were questions in the House of Commons, we are starving a woman. And after 3 days, she was let go. And Mrs. Pankhurst, who wasn't the one who'd originated the whole hunger strike, but when she saw the success of it, she said, right, this is the new policy. The new policy is when we are arrested, we do not pay fines, we go to prison. But now, on top of that, we go on hunger strike. And as you can see, they'll let us out. Well, that only worked for a bit because the prisons started then, and this is only in England, but after letting suffragettes out when they went on hunger strike, the prisons kind of lost their temper with this, and they decided instead to force feed women. Whether this is in London, whether it's in Birmingham or many of the other prisons around England. And as you can see from the image there, this is a particularly horrible type of happening. You would be held down. Now remember, they're probably not going to force feed you until you have been on hunger strike for 3 or 4 days, so you're very weak anyway. And you'll be held down either in a chair or on the bed. You're held down by wardresses, and the prison doctor would come in and he would force a pipe down either in your mouth. He would hold your mouth open with some sort of metal gag, which might actually really damage your teeth as he forced it in. And if he couldn't get you to keep your mouth open, then he would put it instead, the tube would go down your nose. And then once it had gone into your stomach, he would pour a very thin kind of gruel into you until he felt that you had had sufficient. And then he would basically hoik out the tube. And then he would just go next door where the next hunger strike suffragette was, and he would use the same tube. He hadn't disinfected it or anything like that, and he would force it down her throat as well. And women were horribly damaged by this sort of treatment. But some of these women were force-fed over 100 times. So of course you can see from this photograph, you start to get campaigns, the government is murdering women, questions in newspapers, questions in the House of Commons. What are we doing here? This is an absolutely dreadful state of affairs. And militancy, if there's going to be violence on women's bodies in prisons, then there's going to be violence in the outside world. Militancy gets worse and worse, and it comes to Scotland by this point. So we have a variety of different kinds of militancy. It stems from things like acid attacks on pillar boxes. So acid or some noxious muddy ink would be put into the pillar box to destroy all the letters. You have the cutting of telephone wires or the bombing of telephone links. We have acid attacks on the kinds of places where men like to spend their leisure time. So acid attacks on bowling greens or golf courses. So suffragettes would break into golf courses in the dead of night, and they would take their acid and they would write votes for women in acid on the green, destroying the green and sort of making their statement. In Aberdeen, we have a group of suffragettes who actually go out to Balmoral and break into the Balmoral golf course used by the king and daub slogans all over the place, and they change all the little flags around the golf course into suffragette colours of white, purple and green. But you also have much more violent attacks. You have arson attacks, again, on race courses, was it seen as men's activities. Train stations, like the train station at Lucas, is burnt down. They also burnt down the medieval Whitekirk in East Lothian. There was an attempt to burn down Burns Cottage, and another attack on the William Wallace Memorial. A woman called Ethel Moorhead smashes all the glass and is arrested before she can grab hold of what's inside the exhibition there. So it's getting more and more violent, and the concern is amazing. In newspapers, you have horror stories about 3 middle-aged women got off the train in Motherwell this morning. We suspect they may be suffragettes, so be careful because they might be ready to bomb somewhere. Dunfermline Abbey bans women coming to its services on Sundays with a handbag in case they have a bomb in the handbag. So we have a real sort of suffragette fear that, of course, is ramped up by more and more coverage in the press. So the government is getting this very, very bad kind of press about force-feeding women. So in 1913, it changes direction, and it brings in something that is known as the Prisoner's Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, which is normally known as the Cat and Mouse Act. Now, what happens here is you're a suffragette, you've done something, you've been arrested, you've been found guilty, and you go to prison. And you immediately, of course, go on hunger strike. Now, in normal times, they would either release you after 3 days and forget about it, or they would start force feeding you. But under this new act, they would release you when you had weakened yourself, and they would send you home to recuperate. And the idea is you would go home and you would be nursed back to health. And there would be a policeman standing outside your door. And the minute you were healthy enough to actually stand up and to come out of your house, he would rearrest you. And he would take you back to prison, and the clock would start again on your time. And the idea was that it could take years, but you would finally serve your sentence, even if it was just in little bits of 3 days and these weeks of recuperation in between. Of course, it didn't really work like that because the suffragettes didn't go home. They went undercover. And that's why it's called the Cat and Mouse Act. And the suffragettes are the mice hiding in their holes away from the cats, who are the policemen trying to hunt them down to take them back to prison. So Scottish suffragettes are, of course, also released under this act. So Ethel Moorhead, who I mentioned, was the person who smashed William Wallace's exhibition, and she's also suspected of being behind the attempt to burn down Burns Cottage. She is quite frequently released under the Cat and Mouse Act, and she goes to the other end of the country. Sometimes she goes down into England, she changes her name, she changes the way she looks, and she continues to do militant action until she's arrested once more, and then she goes on hunger strike again. This is, by the way, one of the only photos we have of Ethel Moorhead. Now, she basically has stretched the Scottish Prison Service Authorities' patience to its limit with her behaviour. And at the beginning of 1914, she is rearrested once more under suspicion of having set fire to Dundee's Farringdon Hall. And again, she's sent to prison. She goes to Calton Jail in Edinburgh, and once again she goes on hunger strike with the expectation that she will be released under the Cat and Mouse Act. But they decide no, this time they're going to force feed her. But nobody has been force fed in Scotland before, so they don't really, unfortunately, know what they're doing. And they actually put the tube, when they put it down her throat, they put it down the wrong way, and it doesn't go into her stomach, it goes into her lungs, and it nearly kills her. She develops the most severe case of pneumonia and has to be released anyway on grounds of ill health. So the authorities, well, you can imagine that they're thinking, well, that didn't work too well. And they could have decided, right, obviously we're not that good at force feeding, we'll stop trying. Or they could decide to do the thing that they did decide to do, which was, bizarrely, to set up what I can only describe as a centre of excellence for force feeding in Perth Prison. It was deciding from now on that any suffragette prisoner who went on hunger strike would immediately be moved to Perth Prison, and it's there that all the prisoners would now be force fed. And they look around Scotland for a doctor to run this centre for excellence, and no doctor steps forward until they get to Peterhead. And in Peterhead Prison, they find the doctor, and he says, I'll come down to Perth, and this is what I will do. So he comes down, and during the summer of 1914, there are 4 Scottish women who are force-fed at Perth Prison. They're kept in complete solitary confinement, even from each other. They're not allowed any visitors whatsoever from either family or their own physicians. They're not allowed letters at all, and they are force-fed on a regular basis. And one of them, Fanny Parker, is actually not just force-fed through her nose and through her mouth, but this guy from Peterhead is a bit sort of experimental. He also tries to force-feed her through a rectum. And again, with the most awful consequences. Fanny Parker, it turns out, by the way, is the niece of the war hero, Lord Kitchener. And when the family hear what has happened to her, there is an enormous uproar. Now, these women are kept in solitary confinement, but that doesn't mean that they're not aware of their sisters, their suffragettes, because what I can only describe as a proto-Greenham Common camp is set up outside Perth Prison, and women are there all the time, shouting, ringing bells, singing, and in any way trying to communicate with their sisters inside the prison that they are there for them. So this is in the summer of 1914, and I have no idea what would have happened if the situation had gone on. We have militant violence now getting out of control, arson happening across the country, and we have this awful violence being done to women and their bodies in prison. But of course, in the summer of 1914, everything changes because we get the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which then leads inexorably, it almost seems, to the beginning of the First World War. And in the autumn of 1914, the leaders of both the suffragist and the suffragette organisations go to the government and they say, we'd like to declare a truce. We have been campaigning to demonstrate that women can be citizens of this country. Please give us an opportunity to do that. And so the suffragettes are allowed out of prison, and campaigning to a certain extent goes into abeyance as women throw themselves into the war effort. So you have young women going into factories, for example, to make munitions. You have women replacing men, for example, on the Glasgow trams. Women replaced tram drivers so that their men could go to the front. And probably most famously in Scotland, we have the institution of the Scottish Women's Hospitals. This is actually an institution from the suffragist organisation. We have Dr. Elsie Ingalls, who had been very involved in running the constitutional suffragist organisation in Edinburgh. At the beginning of the war, she goes to London, she goes to the War Office, and she said, I have organised an ambulatory hospital. We can go anywhere. We have tents, we have ambulances. We are completely staffed by women. We have women nurses, women doctors, women's ambulance drivers, women cooks, everything. Where would you like us to go? And famously or infamously, the official from the War Office said, my good lady, go home and sit still. But of course she didn't. She went to the French and she said, could you use us? And the French said, oui. And the Belgians also, and the Russians, and the Serbs. By the end of the war, there are 17 distinct Scottish Women Hospitals units working for all of the Allies throughout Europe, but still not being used by the British. And because they're not being used by the British, they're not paid for by the War Office. Instead, they are entirely funded by voluntary contributions. And those voluntary contributions are raised by the organisation, the suffragist organisation in Glasgow and Edinburgh, running all sorts of things, whether it's fetes or collection can day, all sorts of ways to raise money to run the Scottish women's hospitals. I don't want you, however, to think that all the suffragists and all the suffragettes are pro the war, because they are not. There are many women who are absolutely horrified by the war and campaign vigorously against the war. And you know, of course, from your own work about the Glasgow Peace Crusade and things like that. But in many ways, I think that takes even more bravery. It took bravery to stand up on a stool and try and persuade those farmers in Laurencekirk to vote against the government. How much more bravery does it take to stand up on a stool in 1915 and try and say that we should have peace with Germany? So by 1915, 1916, the powers that be are starting to realise that they really have to reform who gets to vote. Not because of women, but because of men. Because if you remember, I said 60% of all men had the parliamentary vote, and the majority of men who didn't have the vote were working class. And those were the kinds of men who were now going overseas. So you had this awful situation that men were being asked to lay down their lives, but they weren't allowed to vote for an MP. And that had to change. On a sort of a more pragmatic approach, it needs to be remembered, of course, that 1917 is the time of the Russian Revolution. And having a working class that you've just trained up in how to use rifles and not giving them a vote, that didn't sound like a very good idea. So we get the general understanding that by 1918, things have to change. We have to have a Reform Act to allow all men over the age of 21 to vote. All men, brackets, but not conscientious objectors. They were not allowed to vote, but everybody else would get a vote. But then the question comes, well, what about women? We don't want to go back to the militancy of the suffragettes after the war. And women, to a certain extent, you know, you can say they played their part. They have demonstrated their ability to be citizens. And that's why in 1918, we have a Reform Act that gives the vote to all men over the age of 21. But not all women over the age of 21. The awful fact of the matter is that somebody had done the maths. And if all women over 21 had been given the vote at that time, because of the carnage of the First World War, there would have been more women voting than men. And that was a step too far. So we have women over the age of 35 with a property qualification. This is quite a small group of women. It's the thin end of the wedge, but it's not until 1928 that all women over the age of 21 get the vote. Nonetheless, in December 1918, there is a general election, and for the first time, some women are allowed to vote. And indeed, some women also stand for election. Bizarrely, there's no age qualification there. So there were women in their 20s who stood to be MPs who weren't even allowed to vote for themselves. We have a number of women throughout the country, including Scotland, who stand for election, but there's only one woman who actually makes it into the House of Commons. Her name is Countess Markievicz, Constance Markievicz, and she stands for Sinn Féin. In fact, she's actually in prison when she's elected. And because Sinn Féin have a policy of not taking up seats in the House of Commons, she's the first person to be elected to the House of Commons, but she's not the first woman to actually take a seat. And that, of course, the following year, 1919, is Nancy Astor who takes her seat. But who's the first Scottish woman to take her seat in the House of Commons? Who's the first Scottish woman MP? Well, it's this woman here. Now, we have seen her before. This is the Duchess of Atholl. But when we saw her before, she was Lady Tullybarden, and she was leading the organisation that campaigned against the vote for women. She seems to have had some sort of Damascene conversion during the First World War, and she actually becomes the first woman MP. Although it is nice to note that in 1928 she still voted against women getting the vote. She's a Conservative Party member. She's known as the Red Duchess, and she is also the first woman to become a minister, but she still voted against women getting the vote in 1928. So that is how Scottish women contributed to the campaign for the votes for women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pedersen. That's an amazing sort of, such a breadth of activism, really, and such a breadth of different responses, I think. Absolutely, really gorgeous to see, and also I think a really good reminder of something that we are very often struck with, which is that that there were activists at every region of Scotland. This is not something that was really localized. Obviously, the population density played a factor, but not really that much. Not as much as you would think, and certainly not as much as we would assume from the kind of dominant narrative in terms of the suffrage movement in the UK. So it's incredibly valuable, and I really can't thank you enough for your for coming and sharing it with us. If you're all right to, what I'd like to do is we'll maybe take a few questions. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, superb. And I know that Ian has one, so I'll just hand over to my colleague from the Protestant Suffragettes team, Ian. And then
before I ask my question, I'd certainly like to add my own thanks to Tara's for that excellent presentation with lots of, I mean, you could fill a book of quotes, I think, with all the great phrases that you had in it. My question was, all these women achieved an awful lot through combined efforts and did a lot for gender relations in the 1910s and 1920s. So how can we do our best to ensure that young people in the 2020s get the best benefit from that experience?
I think it's really, really important to tell school pupils about what happened in their own area. I did this thing for one Aberdeen school where I was talking specifically about the suffrage campaign that happened in Aberdeen. And one of the teachers told me afterwards that a girl said to her, "I didn't know history happened in Aberdeen." And I think it's so important to show them, because they can imagine it. When I'm talking about Aberdeen, I can say this was happening on Union Street. I think how cold it was in February in Union Street, and they can imagine it. Whereas just telling them about what happens in Manchester or London, where lots of them haven't gone, they've not got any images in their heads. It's much more difficult. So telling them about locals, that's great. And then getting them to go and to do some research about local suffrage campaigners is brilliant.
Well, that's really works out as a great endorsement for what we're trying to do ourselves, I think, as well. Absolutely. Tara, I think you had some questions that you'd got in from people.
Yeah, so we do have some questions from the comments. This one is from Sylvia Smith, and she asks about how the Scottish suffragettes were regarded and respected throughout the rest of the UK and throughout the rest of those suffrage movements.
Well, it's kind of a mixed picture, really. There are certain suffragettes, and one person I haven't mentioned is Flora Drummond, who's very much depicted as the Scottish woman, the Scottish suffragette, and another person is Mary Phillips. So there are certain suffragettes who are sort of held up as almost sort of, women always in the kilt kind of thing, Batartans. Very stereotypical. But the rest of the time, if you look at, as I have been doing, look at a lot of the suffrage newspapers and journals, Scotland is kind of ignored. England is where everything's happening, and there's almost an imposition of, oh, it must be just like here, up there as well, wherever these people come from. So that's why it's so important for us to really educate people in what was happening, not just in Scotland, but there are other academics who are doing research about what was happening in Northern Ireland, what was happening in Wales. And it's really important that one suffrage newspaper actually referred to these suffragettes as people on the Celtic periphery. And it's really important to sort of say things were happening at a different pace, they involved different personalities, and that it's not the same. You can't say England fits all. It's very, very different.
And I would also just, if it's if it's not too cheeky to add, I think our own research really focused on Govan. We're always in Glasgow, we are constantly re-investigating or re-examining the meshwork or the network of these women and these organizations. And I think it's a real deficit to today's kind of understanding of the past, but also of the utility of these things in the present, that we don't understand that these kind of meshworks of activism and of kind of creative thinking are really part of what does bring change. I think that's...
Yeah. I think it's really important to realize that these women are not fighting for the vote because they want the vote. They want the vote because they want to do other things. So you've got enmeshing with the temperance movement and the peace movement and people who want to reform sanitary situations. It's all sorts of things. Women are not just saying, I want to put a cross somewhere. They're saying, I want political power for my own particular interests.
Yeah, and I think this is something that's often really not focused on within these conversations, is that these are like, they weren't unified, actually. It was an incredibly diverse and kind of fractious mess of people,
yes,
you know, and that is actually this kind of, I mean, you know, maybe it's easy for us to say now, it's kind of a very rich environment to be thinking about and looking at, you know. It's maybe a little bit less, you probably was more annoying in the moment, but yeah. That's politics, isn't it?
It's also sort of like a catalyst for people learning so much from either the temperance movement or cooperative societies and things like that. So I think again there could be modern parallels for young people.
Absolutely,
today.
certainly with the splitting of parties and the splitting of the suffragettes in particular is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think also something that's often quite lost or meshed together in the way that the sort of contemporary, like surface level understanding of these movements, it wasn't one, it was actually many. So
yes,
I think would you be willing to take another question?
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
Okay, great. So we have a couple more. So this is from Claire, and she wants to know about the image of Helen Fraser. Addressing the hatted gentleman,
yes,
and where that comes from.
Okay, that you can find quite a few of these photographs at Aberdeen University Library. They have them on their website, so it should be somewhere that you can access right now.
Great. And this is a great blessing for things that are digitized, yes. Considering our current season that we're in. So there we have quite a tremendous number of thanks, and really just so people saying the talk is fascinating. We have another question about groups in Northern Ireland and Wales, and maybe just other sort of modern, sort of contemporary women's histories or suffrage groups that you know of, that we as a team could connect with. I think this is from a team member, obviously. So
yeah, I mean, that's kind of difficult to just answer immediately. Just like what's happening in Scotland is only, really being researched now still. The same can be said of Northern Ireland and Wales, and there's some really interesting work that's been done. I can give you links, but I can't think of any sort of non-academic things right at this moment.
Great. No, that's okay. We're open. We're quite academically agnostic. We like academic things, and we like non-academic things as well. May I just take this opportunity to really, I wanted to just highlight also the resource that you had created about Aberdonian suffrage, and to say that we'll pop a link and maybe just do a Facebook, a proper post about that on our socials, just on that. I mean, I think I had tweeted about it privately, but just to pull a little bit through on that resource, and to say in terms of our sort of campaign, the broader one, including the crowdfunder, but not just that. One thing that we're really interested in doing is really gathering these resources that are already in place, because the last thing we want to do is duplicate, no point in that. So we really are interested in just gathering. So this is also just a little bit of a plea or an appeal to the wider hive mind, to just let us know. So, and through this project, we found, you know, because things just sort of come out in a lovely way, we found there was a project on Orcadian suffrage that happened last year. So some things that are smaller, some things that are very in depth, like what you've produced. But anyway, it's just good to know and good to keep. Obviously, Women's History, you know, has a very
website,
substantial resource already online. So we just want to build and not duplicate. Of course, and that door is open. And I hope, I very much hope that you will come back and speak to us again, Sarah.
Please do.
Professor Pedersen. Yeah. I do have one more thing I wanted to ask you about, if that's all right. Or I wanted to just show you. We were wanting to present you, well, it's a bit awkward because obviously we're not in the same physical space, are we? But we wanted to present you with something as just a tiny token of our thanks. There you go. So we have this zine that we have created. It's part of what we have on offer for our crowdfunder, but also, you know, it includes quite a lot of course, women that you will already know and many that you have spoken about today. There is actually a bit on Ethel's experience, which is harrowing and was horrible to hear about, but thank you for telling us about that. But we also have, because as we had spoken about before, we tend to spend a lot of time looking for direct quotes. So there is quite a long quote about her experience, actually, which Ian found, and some information on force feeding. But we also have, on a lighter note, collages and information on women like Agnes Dolan, Helen Crawford, etc. So we'll be delighted to, we'll be in touch and we can send that to you. Of course, it's our absolute pleasure. And
no, I've very much enjoyed doing this. And if anybody does want to get in contact with me, I'm happy to direct you to other resources, either about stuff I've written or that other people have written. And I think probably the most important message I can have for everybody is, you know, these women did so much. For goodness sake, make sure you use your vote.
Yeah. We'll just pause and emphasize that. So, because I think there is literally little that is more important right now in terms of civic activity than that. So I want also to just say, if you don't mind, we've got a couple of other talks in our series coming up. So for those who are still with us, we have a talk this coming Wednesday on the 9th. We'll be hearing from Leslie Orr specifically about Helen Crawford, and obviously Leslie's someone who's written tremendously about that. Specifically, she's an historian. And Helen Crawford is someone, of course, you spoke about or alluded to because she was part of that group of suffragettes who campaigned for peace very actively. And on Friday, the 11th of September, so a week from tomorrow, we have Sarah Sheridan, the author who wrote the book, Where Are the Women? So also a nice kind of, breadth of amazing women that we get to hear from. So thank you so much, Professor Pedersen. That's really—
yes, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really our pleasure to have you, and thank you for your support of our project. It's an honor.
It's a fantastic project.
Thank you so much. Okay, goodbye everyone in the hive mind. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.